The silence that fell over the town square of Ridgecreek, Colorado on that warm September evening in 1882 was the kind that pressed against a person's chest like a stone. Emma Brooks stood behind the long trestle table where the decorated supper baskets were lined up in a row, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white, and she watched as every single man in the crowd turned his back on her basket. Not slowly, not reluctantly. Quickly, deliberately, with the kind of cold intention that told her this was not an accident. This was a message, and the message was, you do not belong here anymore. The Supper Basket Social was the most important fundraiser Ridgecreek held each year. Every unmarried woman in town prepared a basket of food, decorated it with ribbons and wildflowers and whatever small tokens of personality she dared to display, and the men bid on them. The man who won the basket would share supper with the woman who made it. It was tradition. It was courtship. It was the lifeblood of a community that had very few other formal ways for young men and women to find one another. And for 3 years running, Emma's basket had been among the most hotly contested. Not this year. She had known something was wrong the moment she arrived. The whispers had started at the edge of the crowd, and they moved through the gathered townsfolk like a brush fire through dry grass. She had heard fragments, dark past, betrayal, her father's secrets. She had told herself to hold her chin up, that whatever rumors Harlan Price had been spreading since last Tuesday were just that, rumors, and that the people of Ridgecreek knew her well enough to see through them. She had been wrong. One by one, the baskets were presented by the auctioneer, a round-faced man named Gerald Stubbs, who had the enthusiastic voice of a carnival barker on better occasions. But when he held up Emma's basket, with its blue gingham ribbon and the small dried lavender stems tied to the handle, the crowd went silent in the most devastating way. Not the silence of anticipation, the silence of refusal. Gerald Stubbs called out a starting bid of 50 cents, the standard opening. He waited. He glanced around the crowd with an expression that shifted slowly from professional cheerfulness to profound discomfort. He called again. He dropped the opening bid to 25 cents, which was an embarrassment in itself, a violation of the unspoken rules that said you never lowered the opening bid, because lowering it implied the contents were not worth the standard amount. Emma felt her face go hot. She felt the burning behind her eyes that she refused to let spill over, because she was not going to cry in front of these people. She was not going to give Harlan Price that satisfaction. She could see him at the front of the crowd, standing with his arms crossed and a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. He was 41 years old, built like a saloon door, and he had come to her 2 weeks ago with what he called an offer. What he actually brought her was a threat wrapped in pleasantries. Marry him, he had said, or he would tell everyone in Ridgecreek what her father had done before he died. The nature of the debt. The nature of the man her father had been in his worst years. Emma had told him no. This was what no looked like. Gerald Stubbs was already beginning to lower the basket with a look of profound apology forming on his round face when a voice came from the very back of the crowd. $1. The words were not loud. They were not theatrical. They were simply precise and clear and utterly calm, in the way that a bell is clear, cutting through everything else without trying to. Every head turned. Emma turned too, craning her neck to see past the gathered crowd of perhaps 60 or 70 people, past the bonnets and the broad-brimmed hats, past the children who had wiggled to the front, past the cluster of ranch hands from the Delacroix spread who stood together in a knot of denim and leather. At the very back of the crowd, standing slightly apart from everyone else, was a man she had seen before but never spoken to. He was not remarkably tall, though he was certainly not short. He was lean without being thin, with the kind of quiet physical self-possession that comes from years of practical work. His hat was dark brown and his coat was a deep charcoal gray, and he held his hat in his hands now, turning it slowly at the brim in a way that betrayed the only nervousness he showed. His hair was dark and his jaw was clean-shaven, which was unusual in Ridgecreek where most of the men wore beards or mustaches as a matter of course. His eyes from this distance were indeterminate in color, but they were fixed on Gerald Stubbs with absolute certainty. Simon Ellsworth. That was his name. He had come to Ridgecreek about 4 months ago, in late May, and had taken a position as a surveyor's assistant for the Colorado and Southern Land Survey crew that had been mapping the territory boundaries around the county. He was quiet. He was polite when addressed. He ate his meals at the boarding house run by Widow Calloway, and he drank coffee rather than whiskey at the saloon, and he had never once been involved in any of the town's social dramas. He was, by every measure, the most private person in Ridgecreek, which was why his presence at the supper basket social had seemed mildly surprising to begin with, and why his single bid now felt like a thunderclap. Harlan Price turned around slowly. His smile had not entirely disappeared, but it had changed. It had acquired an edge. Gerald Stubbs, with the relief of a man who has just been saved from drowning, called out brightly, "$1 bid. Do I hear $1.25? The crowd was still looking at Simon Ellsworth. Simon Ellsworth was looking at Gerald Stubbs. He did not look at Harlan Price. He did not look at Emma, not yet. He simply waited. "Going once at $1, Gerald Stubbs said carefully, and there was a very long pause during which the world seemed to hold its breath, during which Emma Brooks felt something shift in her chest in a way she could not immediately name, during which Harlan Price uncrossed and recrossed his arms, during which the children at the front of the crowd stopped fidgeting, going twice, and sold to Mr. Ellsworth at the back for $1. A low murmur moved through the crowd. Harlan Price's smile was completely gone now. He watched Simon Ellsworth make his way through the crowd toward Gerald Stubbs, and the expression on Price's face was not anger exactly. It was calculation. It was the expression of a man who had just been introduced to a new obstacle and was already deciding what to do about it. Emma did not know, standing at that table with her hands still knotted together and the hot press of unshed tears still behind her eyes, that the quiet man walking toward her with her gingham-ribboned basket in his hands was carrying secrets of his own, that he had a dark past that intersected with Ridgecreek in ways she could not have imagined, that the forced choice she had already made, the no she had said to Harlan Price, was about to pull both her and Simon Ellsworth into something far more dangerous than a simple supper social humiliation. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew in that immediate moment was that a man she had never properly spoken to had just stepped forward when everyone else had stepped back, and she was not sure whether to feel grateful or afraid. She decided, watching him accept the basket from Gerald Stubbs and tuck it under his arm with the careful handling of a man who understood that it represented something more important than food, to feel both. Gratitude and fear were not mutually exclusive. She had learned that much from her father, if nothing else. Simon Ellsworth turned, and for the first time that evening his eyes found hers across the crowd. They were gray, she saw now. A clear, steady gray, the color of a sky just before the weather turns. He held her gaze for one moment, and in that moment he did not smile. He did not wink. He did not perform the small social gestures that would have signaled that he understood this to be a public kindness and nothing more. He simply looked at her with the full weight of his attention, and then he began to walk in her direction, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds always part for people who move with certainty. She was going to have to talk to him. That realization, somehow, terrified her more than anything Harlan Price had said or done. To understand why Emma Brooks was standing behind that table with her world quietly collapsing around her, it was necessary to go back 6 weeks, to the first week of August, when her father died. William Brooks had not been a famous man, or a powerful one, or even a particularly well-liked one in his final years. He had once been a respected farmer and occasional buyer of cattle, with a small but prosperous piece of land 3 miles east of Ridgecreek that produced good corn and adequate hay, and sustained a modest herd of mixed cattle. He had raised Emma alone after her mother passed of the fever when Emma was 9 years old. He had done his imperfect best, which included stretches of real warmth and humor, but also stretches of hard silence and the particular sadness of a man who had never fully reconciled himself to the permanence of his loss. In his last 5 years, he had made some very poor decisions. The land was the first casualty. He had borrowed against it in 1878, when a late spring frost killed most of the crop, and he needed to buy feed to keep the cattle alive through the summer. The loan had come from Harlan Price, who was not a banker but who had the kind of liquid capital that passed for banking credit on the frontier. The terms had been, in Emma's recollection, reasonable on the surface. In practice, with the interest that accumulated and the dry year that followed and the dropping price of cattle, the loan had grown rather than shrunk, and by the time William Brooks died in August of 1882 at the age of 57 from a heart that had simply worn itself out, he owed Harlan Price an amount of money that was, against the value of the remaining land and livestock, essentially everything. There was more, though. There was the other part, the part that Price had come to Emma with 2 weeks after the funeral, when she was still raw with grief and still trying to understand the papers her father had left behind. He sat across from her in her own kitchen and told her calmly that her father had, during one of his worst years, been involved in something that Price had helped him cover up. He did not specify details in that first conversation. He did not need to. The shape of what he was implying was enough to make Emma's blood go cold. He said that the debt was not merely financial. He said that if she were interested in protecting her father's name and her own position in the community, there was a simple arrangement that could settle all of it: marry him. He was not asking, not really. A request could be declined without consequence. This was a mechanism, a forced choice between two versions of ruin, and the only reason it had not already been executed was that Price found her useful as a future wife, and therefore had reasons to preserve her reputation in the short term. She had said no. She had said it clearly, and she had asked him to leave her house, and he had gone without drama because men like Harlan Price did not need to make scenes. They had other tools. The tools had become visible at the supper social. What Emma did not know, and would not know for another 3 days after the social, was that Simon Ellsworth had his own complicated relationship with Harlan Price. Not a visible one, not a publicized one. Simon had come to Ridgecreek with purpose beyond the surveyor's work, though the surveying was real enough and he did it competently. He had come because Harlan Price was a man he had been tracking for the better part of 2 years, not personally, not as some kind of lone vigilante, but as a witness. In 1880, Simon Ellsworth had been working as a junior land agent in Pueblo, and he had been present when a set of fraudulent land deed transfers had passed through the office, transfers that had robbed 3 farming families of their properties, and that had ultimately been traced to a shell company that led back to, through several carefully obscured layers of paperwork, Harlan Price. 2 of those 3 families had left the territory. One had stayed and taken it to the district land court, and the case was still crawling through the legal system 2 years later, waiting for additional evidence, which was precisely what Simon had been sent to find. He was working, quietly and without advertisement, in loose partnership with a district court representative named Aldous Webb, who had hired him as an informal investigator. The surveying gave him legitimate reason to be in Ridgecreek. The surveying also gave him access to land records and local gossip without appearing to seek either. He had not planned to attend the supper basket social. He had gone because Webb had sent him a letter suggesting that the Brooks farm situation might yield relevant documentation, that William Brooks had been one of Price's victims in a more deliberate way than a simple bad luck loan, and that the daughter might have access to papers that could help the case. Simon had thought the social might give him a chance to see who Emma Brooks was before approaching her formally, to assess whether she was trustworthy and whether she understood the full scope of what her father had been drawn into. He had not planned to bid on her basket. He had planned to stand at the back and observe and leave quietly afterward. But then he had watched the entire crowd turn its back on her, watched the deliberate cruelty of it, watched Harlan Price standing at the front with that slow smile of satisfaction, and something in Simon Ellsworth that was usually very well governed had made a decision entirely independent of his investigative agenda. He had bid $1. It was not, in retrospect, the most strategically sound thing he had ever done. Announcing his presence to Price in this way was not ideal. But he had done it, and now he was walking toward Emma Brooks with her supper basket under his arm, and he was going to have to sit down with her and share whatever she had packed, and he was going to have to be extremely careful about what he said and how he said it. The supper portion of the social took place in the adjacent field behind the church, where wooden tables had been set out under paper lanterns that the ladies' auxiliary had spent a week making. Couples took their baskets to whatever table was available and shared the meal as the fiddle players struck up something lively on the church steps. It was designed to be charming, and under other circumstances, Simon imagined it was. He and Emma found a table at the far edge of the field, slightly removed from the others, partly by her choice, and partly because the closer tables were occupied by people who were watching them with transparent curiosity. He set the basket on the table, and they both sat down, and there was a full 10 seconds of silence between them that was awkward in the specific way that two very private people being unexpectedly thrust into close proximity creates. "Thank you," Emma said finally. She had a low, steady voice with a quality of careful control in it that Simon recognized because he practiced the same thing himself. She was not going to show him how much the evening had cost her. "You did not have to do that. I wanted a good supper," he said. She gave him a look that was sharply skeptical and also slightly amused, which he had not expected. The amusement, brief as it was, changed her face considerably. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair and dark eyes, and the kind of face that was serious in repose, but animated when something caught her attention. She had the particular quality of self-containment that came from having been alone in a difficult situation for a long time. He recognized that too. "I packed fried chicken, cornbread, pickled beets, and a piece of apple cake," she said, beginning to unpack the basket with the methodical movements of someone who needed something to do with her hands. "It is probably the most conventional thing in that row of baskets." "Conventional is underrated," Simon said. She set a cloth across the table between them and began laying out the food, and for a moment they were occupied with the small practicalities of it, and the small practicalities created a kind of temporary peace, the way useful tasks always did. Simon watched her hands while he appeared to look at the food. Her hands were not idle hands, not ornamental. They were the hands of a woman who did real work, which he had already known from the land record descriptions, but which was more immediate in person. "You are the surveyor," she said. "Simon Ellsworth." "That's right. You have been in Ridgecreek since May." "Since the 23rd of May," he confirmed. She looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes. "Why have you never spoken to me before tonight?" It was a direct question, more direct than the social conventions of the time typically sanctioned on first acquaintance, which told him that she was not a woman who found social conventions particularly useful when there was something real to understand. He decided to match her directness in the only safe way he could. "I am not very good at social occasions," he said. It was true enough. She considered this. "Neither am I, apparently," she said, with a slight dryness that acknowledged the evening's events without dwelling on them. They ate for a while. The chicken was very good. The apple cake was exceptional. Simon, who ate most of his meals from the indifferent kitchen at Widow Calloway's boarding house, found himself paying genuine attention to the food in a way that was not strategic. "Harlan Price," he said, when they had been sitting together long enough that a more serious word seemed natural rather than abrupt. He kept his voice low. "Has he spoken to you recently?" Everything in Emma's posture changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that the neighboring tables could have read, but Simon was watching closely, and he saw the way the warmth that had been slowly, cautiously building between them over the last half hour went absolutely still. She set down the piece of cornbread she had been holding. "Why would you ask me that?" Her voice was very careful. "Because what happened tonight did not happen by accident," he said. And Price was standing at the front of that crowd. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, deciding how much to say, weighing him against her knowledge of his character, which was not extensive because they had barely spoken before this evening, and measuring that against her need, which she was clearly trying to minimize by sheer force of will. "He came to see me," she said finally, "about my father's debts." And the single syllable was too direct. She pulled back slightly, not physically but in some way that was nonetheless visible. "That is a private matter, Mr. Ellsworth." "I know," he said. And then, because he had to make a decision about how much truth to offer, and he had decided, somewhere in the process of walking across that field with her basket, that she deserved more honesty than he had originally planned to give her, he said quietly, "I am not in Ridgecreek only as a surveyor." She went very still. "Then what are you?" "I am trying to help bring Harlan Price to account for what he has done to people in this county," he said. "Not with guns, with evidence. With the land court in Pueblo, the proper legal way." She stared at him. The paper lantern swayed slightly overhead in the evening breeze, and the fiddle music from the church steps was something quick and cheerful that felt entirely disconnected from this table, this conversation. A long silence extended between them, and it was not comfortable, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of someone reassessing everything they thought they understood about the current situation. "You are an investigator," she said. "Something like that. And you think my father was involved in whatever he did." "I think your father was a victim of it," Simon said. He said it simply and without softness, because he thought she would trust directness more than she would trust gentleness. "I think Price made your father believe he had no options, and then used those circumstances to extract what he wanted from him. I think whatever Price has told you about your father's actions reflects a deliberate manipulation." He watched something move through her face then. It was not exactly relief, because the situation was still terrible and nothing was yet resolved. It was more like the particular kind of recognition that comes when someone finally names the thing you have been struggling to name yourself. Her father had not been a villain. Her father had been trapped. She had suspected this, he could see from the way she absorbed what he said, but suspicion and certainty were very different things, and hearing it said plainly by someone who had evidence to support it was doing something significant to the set of her shoulders. "What does he have?" she asked. Her voice was not entirely steady now. "We are not certain yet. That is part of why I need to look at whatever papers your father left behind." "I have boxes of papers," she said. "I have not been able to make sense of most of them." "I might be able to," Simon said. She looked at him for another long moment, and he stayed very still under that look, because it was a look that was trying to determine whether he was trustworthy or whether this was simply a more sophisticated version of the same trap Price had set. He thought she was intelligent enough to be uncertain, which was the right response. Certainty, in this situation, would have been naive. "Why did you bid on my basket?" she asked. "You could have approached me tomorrow at my farm. You did not need to do this." He considered the honest answer to that question, and found that it was a more complicated answer than he had expected, because the real reason he had bid on her basket had not been entirely strategic, or even primarily strategic. He had watched the crowd turn its back on her, and something in him had responded to it in a way that he could not fully explain through the lens of his work for Aldous Webb. "Because no one should be left standing there alone like that," he said. "And I knew I was going to speak to you eventually, so the timing was not unreasonable." It was not the whole answer, but it was the true part of the answer, and she seemed to sense this, to understand that he was being selective rather than dishonest. "Come to my farm tomorrow afternoon," she said. "I will have the papers ready for you to look at." He nodded. "And Mr. Ellsworth," she said, as they both rose from the table and she began to gather the remnants of their supper back into the basket. He waited. "Whatever you find in those papers, I want to know all of it. I am not someone who is better off not knowing things." "I understand," he said. She nodded once with the economy of a person who did not waste gestures, and then she walked back toward the crowd with her empty basket, and Simon stood at the edge of the lantern light and watched her go, and he noted, with a kind of internal wariness that was new to him, that he was already thinking about tomorrow afternoon in a way that went beyond the documents. That was a complication he had not foreseen. The Brooks farm was 3 miles east of Ridgecreek, along a road that was more of a suggestion than an actual road. A pair of wheel ruts through the yellowed late-summer grass that wound around the base of a low ridge, and opened eventually into a modest property that had once been better kept than it currently was. Simon arrived at 2 in the afternoon on horseback, having borrowed the animal from the surveying crew's stock. The house was a single-story structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney, the kind of house that had been built with care and maintained with diminishing energy over the years. There was a kitchen garden that had been kept up far better than the rest of the property, and a small barn that was structurally sound if not pretty, and a yard with 2 chickens of monumental self-importance who regarded Simon's horse with deep suspicion. Emma came to the door before he had tied the horse to the post, which told him she had been watching for him. She was wearing a plain cotton dress of dark blue and a practical apron, and she had the look of a woman who had spent the morning doing physical work and had decided not to change for his visit because changing would have implied a formality she was not prepared to extend. He appreciated this. He tied the horse and came to the door, and she stepped back to let him in. The interior of the house was spare and extremely clean and smelled of wood smoke and the lingering sweetness of the coffee that was on the stove. There was a kitchen and a sitting room that were essentially one continuous space, and a doorway that led to what he assumed was a bedroom. On the kitchen table, she had stacked 3 wooden boxes full of papers. "I found everything I could," she said. "There is more in the barn, older records, but I do not think those would be relevant." Simon took off his hat and set it on the chair she indicated and sat down at the table and began to go through the first box. Emma sat across from him with a cup of coffee, which she did not offer to share for the first 15 minutes, which he found slightly amusing, until she seemed to remember herself and got up and poured him a cup without asking whether he wanted one, which he found more amusing still. The papers were a mixture of things: farm records, receipts, correspondence, legal documents in the technical language of land transfers that were dense and difficult even for someone who knew what he was looking for. Simon worked steadily and carefully, and Emma watched him work, and after about 30 minutes she got up and began doing other tasks around the room, mending something, then washing dishes, then coming back to look over his shoulder periodically with a focused frown. "This one," he said, pulling a paper from the second box and setting it flat on the table. "This is a transfer of lien document." She leaned over his shoulder to look at it, and she was close enough that he could smell the faint lavender of her hair, which was the same lavender she had used in the basket the previous evening, and he made an internal note to keep his attention on the document. "My father signed this in the spring of 1880, she said, reading the date. "He did, but look at the witness signature," he pointed. "Harlan Price witnessed this document. That means he had direct knowledge of the terms, which contradicts what he told the county land office, which was that this lien was a voluntary transfer. If it was voluntary, Price should not have been positioned as witness. His witness signature indicates he was a party, which is fraud." Emma straightened up slowly. "That is evidence," she said. "Part of it." He kept moving through the papers. "There is more, I think. They spent 3 hours at that table." Simon found 4 documents of various kinds that constituted together a meaningful portion of the additional evidence that Aldous Webb needed for the Pueblo case. Emma read each document as he identified it, and she was quicker than he had expected, though he could not have said why he had expected otherwise. She asked sharp questions, and she did not need things explained twice, and she identified one connection between 2 documents that he had nearly missed. "You are very good at this," he said, and then felt slightly self-conscious about saying it because it sounded condescending in retrospect, as though he had expected her to be otherwise. She gave him a look that was amused rather than offended. "I kept my father's farm accounts from the time I was 16, she said. "He was not good with numbers, I was." "Why did you not figure out the fraud yourself?" "Because I did not know what I was looking for. I knew the numbers were wrong. I did not know what the wrongness meant in legal terms." He nodded. He had what he needed or close to it. He should have made arrangements to send these documents to Webb, and then kept his relationship with Emma Brooks at a professional distance, because anything beyond that was a complication he did not have room for. His work in Ridgecreek would be concluded whenever the documents were submitted, and he would move on to the next assignment, and that was the shape of his life and had been for 2 years. "What happens next?" she asked. "I send these to the district court. Webb presents them. The case against Price is heard. If the evidence is sufficient, and I believe it will be, Price will face charges of land fraud and coercive debt manipulation, which are serious offenses." "How long does it take?" He hesitated. "These things are slow, 6 months, possibly longer." She absorbed this. "In 6 months," she said carefully, "what is to stop Price from continuing to make my life difficult in this town?" "Nothing," was the honest answer. For the next 6 months, Emma Brooks was still vulnerable to every social and financial tool Harlan Price had available to him, and those tools were not nothing. He had already demonstrated at the supper social that he could effectively isolate her from the community, and social isolation was not a trivial thing on the frontier, where community was often the only thing standing between a single woman and complete practical disaster. Simon sat with this for a moment. He was not a man who made commitments carelessly. He was also not a man who thought through the implications of his commitments with sufficient care before making them, which was a character flaw he acknowledged when it surfaced. "I will stay in Ridgecreek until the case is resolved," he said. Emma looked at him. "Your surveying work will be done before that." "I can find other work. I have other skills." "What skills?" "I can build things. I am good with horses. I know land. I can work for any of the ranch operations in the area until this is finished." She was looking at him with that careful, measuring expression again. "Why would you do that?" He thought about the basket. He thought about the crowd turning its back. He thought about the specific expression on her face in the moment before she had composed herself, the expression that she had almost successfully hidden and that he had caught anyway, the one that looked like a person absorbing a blow they had been told not to show. "Because you should not have to go through the next 6 months alone," he said. And then, because he was watching her face very carefully and he saw the way his words landed, the complex mix of vulnerability and resistance and something quieter underneath both of them, he added, "And because I would like to." A long pause. "You are a very unusual man, Mr. Ellsworth," she said finally. "So I've been told." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the ancestor of a smile, the place where one lived before it had fully formed. "You had better have real skills with horses," she said. "The Delacroix Ranch needs a good hand for their fall roundup. I know Aurélie Delacroix well enough to put in a word. I would appreciate that. I make no promises about the rest of it," she said clearly. She was looking at him directly, which she had been doing throughout their conversation, but this look was different, a little more unguarded. "I do not know you, Mr. Ellsworth. I am grateful for what you did last night and for what you are doing with these papers. But I do not extend trust quickly." "Neither do I," he said. Something in his simple agreement seemed to satisfy her in a way that a more elaborate reassurance would not have. She nodded. She got up and poured more coffee, and this time she offered to refresh his cup before she poured her own, which was a small thing but not nothing. They talked for another hour, about matters less significant than the legal case, about the farm and the survey work and the landscape of this part of Colorado, and the way the light fell differently here than it did in other places he had worked. Emma had lived her entire life within 30 miles of Ridgecreek and was not embarrassed about this, but she was deeply curious about the world beyond it, and her questions about the places he had been were not the decorative social questions of polite conversation, but the genuine questions of someone building a map in her mind of everything she did not yet know. He rode back to Ridgecreek in the early evening, through the golden September light that turned the grass to copper, and he was honest with himself about the fact that the afternoon had not proceeded according to any plan he had made for it. He had gone to review documents. He had reviewed documents. He had also spent the better part of 3 hours in the company of a woman who was sharper and funnier and more quietly substantial than he had anticipated, and he had told her he intended to stay in Ridgecreek through the resolution of the case in a way that had not been entirely motivated by professional responsibility. The next morning, he sent the documents to Aldous Webb via the stage line and began the process of settling more permanently into Ridgecreek life. The Delacroix Ranch, which ran about 1,400 acres of mixed grazing land to the north and west of town, was operated by Francois Delacroix, a French-Canadian who had come to Colorado in the 1860s, and his wife Aurélie, who was from New Orleans originally, and who ran the domestic and social operations of the ranch with the calm authority of a general. They had 4 hands already and were, as Emma had correctly identified, in need of additional help for the fall roundup, which would take about 3 weeks and required extra personnel. Simon presented himself at the Delacroix Ranch on a Monday morning, and Francois Delacroix, who was a practical man with very little interest in social drama, hired him after a 20-minute conversation and a demonstration with a rope that satisfied Delacroix's standards. He was assigned bunkhouse quarters and a decent working horse named Galveston, who had the useful trait of staying calm under pressure. Aurélie Delacroix, who was perhaps 40 and who looked at everything with the same bright, comprehensive attention, told him over supper that first evening that she had heard about the supper basket social. She told him this while passing the bread rolls very casually in a way that made clear it was not casual at all. "Emma Brooks is a good woman," Aurélie said. "She has had a very hard summer." "I know," Simon said, "and you plan to stay in Ridgecreek for a while. It was not quite a question." "I do," he said. Aurélie Delacroix smiled with the particular quality of someone who has drawn a conclusion and is choosing not to state it directly. "Good," she said, and passed the salt. Over the following weeks, Simon found a rhythm to his life in Ridgecreek that was unlike any rhythm he had established elsewhere, because for the first time in 2 years, he was staying somewhere long enough to be part of it. The roundup was hard, physical, all-day work that left him pleasantly exhausted rather than restlessly wounded. He was good with cattle and good with the other hands, and he worked without complaint and without drama, and by the end of the first week, he had earned the regard of the other Delacroix men in the straightforward way that frontier men accorded regard, which was based on competence and reliability, and whether you pulled your weight. He saw Emma on Sundays. They established this gradually, without formally agreeing to it, beginning the second Sunday after the social when he rode out to her farm in the afternoon and helped her split some wood that was beyond the manageable size for her axe, and she made coffee, and the conversation was easy in a way that surprised him. And when he left at dusk, she told him she would see him next Sunday, which was the closest either of them came to an explicit arrangement. The Sundays became the fixed point of his week. He brought things she needed sometimes when they were easily come by. A bag of flour from the general store when he could see from the state of her bread that her supply was running low. A new leather hinge for the barn door that had been troubling her. She cooked well, and the meals she made for him on those Sunday afternoons were a different category of experience from anything available at the boarding house or the ranch bunkhouse, not because they were elaborate, they were not, but because they were made with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Between Sundays, he thought about her more than he meant to. He also kept a watchful eye on Harlan Price. Price had not made any overt moves in the weeks since the social, which was not reassuring. Men like Price did not simply stop because their first plan had encountered resistance. They regrouped. Simon had learned this in 2 years of circling the man's operations, watching the way he absorbed setbacks and recalculated. Price had noticed Simon clearly and would by now have made inquiries about him. Simon's backstory was not airtight. The surveying connection was real, but his prior history in Pueblo, if Price dug deep enough, might yield details that revealed his connection to the Webb investigation. He wrote to Webb about this concern. Webb wrote back to say the case was progressing but would still require several more months, and that Simon should remain in place and maintain his cover as naturally as possible. He also wrote, in the tight, careful language of someone conveying important news through channels that might be read by others, that the evidence Simon had sent from the Brooks farm had been very valuable, more valuable than expected. There were additional names involved beyond Price, names connected to a wider scheme of land fraud that went beyond Ridgecreek County. Simon read this letter by the bunkhouse lantern after the other hands were asleep, and felt the particular chill that always came with the confirmation that a situation was more complicated than it appeared. He told Emma about this on the third Sunday of October, when the first cold air was coming down from the mountains, and she had made an apple cider that she heated on the stove and served with cinnamon, which was a small domestic luxury that seemed entirely like her, the specific combination of practicality and unexpected warmth. They were sitting at her kitchen table with the hot cider, and he explained what Webb had said about the scope of the fraud, without naming names he did not yet have. She listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hand, and her expression was that concentrated, undecorated attention she gave to everything he said that he had come to find extraordinary in its way, because she was genuinely listening, not performing listening. So my father was part of something bigger than just one bad loan, she said. He was used as part of something bigger. I want to be precise about that. There is a difference. She looked at him. You keep making that distinction, she said, between being used and being culpable, because it matters. You are being careful of my feelings, she said. It was not an accusation, but it was not quite an acceptance either. I am being accurate, Simon said. And then, because he had found over the past weeks that the most reliable way to earn her trust was to give her honesty even when it was uncomfortable, he said, your father signed documents he should not have signed. He was afraid and he made choices that compromised himself. That is the truth, and I think you already know it, which is why you needed me to say that the fear was manufactured. Both things are true, Emma. He had started using her given name somewhere around the fourth Sunday, and she had not corrected him, which was permission. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the cider cooled. I know, she said finally, and her voice was low and a little rough, the way it got when something was costing her. I know he was not blameless. He was just my father. I know, Simon said. A silence followed that was not empty. Simon had learned to be comfortable with Emma's silences, which were full rather than absent. She was thinking, always thinking, turning things over with that interior thoroughness that was one of the qualities of her character he had most come to respect. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. What happens to this farm when the legal case is resolved? She met his eyes with the direct look she used when she wanted to make sure she understood exactly what was being said. The debts were to Price. If Price is convicted of fraud, does the debt structure change? Do I keep this land? This was a legal question he had wanted to be very certain about before answering, and he had asked Webb about it specifically, and had received a response only the previous week. If Price is convicted of coercive fraud, the debt instruments he holds can be challenged and potentially vacated, Simon said. That means the loan against the land may be found to be invalid under the fraud ruling. You would need a lawyer to pursue it formally, but the path exists. Emma released a breath that she had been holding, or so it seemed to Simon, for quite some time, possibly since her father died. Good, she said quietly. This is my land. My mother is buried here. I will not lose it to him. You will not, Simon said, with a firmness that he recognized, hearing it in his own voice. as personal commitment rather than professional assessment. She looked at him then with something different in her expression, something that was not the careful measuring look or the intellectually engaged look or the quietly emotional look he had catalogued in the weeks of their Sundays. This was simpler and more direct, and he did not immediately have a name for it, only a physical response to it that he was not sure what to do with. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and this time it was not a challenge or a deflection but a real question, a question she was asking because she wanted the real answer. He thought about the truthful answer for a moment. "At first, because it was the job," he said. "And then because you deserve to have someone on your side who was not going to put conditions on it." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, just for a moment, her fingers cool from holding the cider cup. It was not a romantic gesture, exactly. It was something older and more fundamental than romance, the gesture of a person acknowledging another person's presence in a way that words were insufficient for. Then she withdrew her hand and picked up her cup, and the moment moved into the flow of everything else, and they continued talking about practical things now, about the approaching winter and the farm's needs, about the state of the barn roof, about which of the remaining cattle she intended to sell before the first hard frost. But the moment had happened. It was in the record. November came in hard. The Colorado winter on the high plains was not the soft, picturesque winter of fiction. It was cold with an absolute physical authority that required preparation and respect. Simon threw himself into the pre-winter work at the Delacroix Ranch and into the pre-winter work at Emma's farm on Sundays. And the Sundays were longer now because the work was more extensive, and because neither of them had, he thought, any particular motivation to cut them short. There was a Sunday in mid-November when a snowstorm came in unexpectedly in the late afternoon, while he was still at the farm, helping her bank the foundation of the house with additional insulation, and it came in fast enough that leaving on horseback would have been genuinely dangerous. Emma considered this for about 30 seconds and then told him without any fuss that he could sleep in the barn, which was heated by the cattle and the 2 horses, and which she had a spare bedroll for from her father's years of having ranch hands. He slept in the barn with the cattle and the 2 horses and the pair of extremely opinionated chickens, who had by this point decided to spend their nights in the barn rather than the hen house. And he lay awake for a while listening to the storm outside and the warm animal sounds around him, and he thought about what his life had looked like before Ridgecreek and what it looked like now, and the difference between the two was not subtle. In the morning the storm had passed and left a foot of new snow, and Emma was already in the yard when he came out, booted and coated, feeding the livestock with her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She had made a large pot of oatmeal which was on the stove, and she told him to eat before he started the ride back, and they sat at the table with the oatmeal and hot coffee and the early winter light coming through the kitchen window, and it was such a completely domestic, undramatic scene that it somehow clarified everything that the more significant moments had only begun to suggest. He was in love with her. This was not a comfortable realization, not because it was unwelcome, but because it immediately introduced a set of complications that his more organized self immediately began cataloging. He was in Ridgecreek under circumstances that were temporary and potentially dangerous. The case against Price was not resolved. His life was not settled. Emma Brooks had a complicated set of circumstances of her own, a farm under legal threat, a community that had been turned against her, a grief for her father that was still working itself through her. And she had told him clearly back at the beginning that she did not extend trust quickly. But he sat across the kitchen table from her in the winter morning light with the oatmeal and the coffee, and he was in love with her, and there was not very much to be done about the fact. He rode back to the Delacroix Ranch through the snow with Galveston picking his way carefully along the white blanketed road, and he resolved to say nothing about it until the situation with Price was resolved, because declaring himself now would be an imposition, a kind of pressure that she did not need on top of everything else she was managing. He kept this resolution for 3 weeks. In early December, Harlan Price made his next move. Simon heard about it from Aurélie Delacroix, who heard it from Mrs. Stubbs, whose husband was the auctioneer and who was therefore deeply embedded in the social information network of Ridgecreek. Price had gone to the county land clerk and filed a formal demand for collection on the Brooks Farm debt, citing breach of repayment terms. The filing was legal on its face. It initiated a process whereby, if the debt was not paid within 60 days, the land could be seized and sold to satisfy the obligation. 60 days. Mid-February. Simon sent an urgent letter to Webb the same day. He also, that same evening, rode out to Emma's farm in the near dark of a December dusk, which was not a Sunday, and knocked on her door. She opened it and looked at him and immediately understood from his expression that he had news. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. He told her about the filing as clearly and completely as he could. He watched her face go through several things as she absorbed it, none of them pleasant. She sat down at the table and was quiet for a moment. 60 days, she said. Yes. And the court case in Pueblo. Webb will argue for an injunction against collection pending the fraud investigation, Simon said. It is the right legal move. The question is whether the court will grant it and how quickly. How quickly do you think? I do not know, he said honestly. The holidays will slow things. January is possible. I'm going to write to Webb again tonight with a more urgent request. Emma sat very still for a moment. Then she got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark farm yard and the thin crescent moon over the ridge, and Simon stayed seated and gave her the space of it. I have some savings, she said, without turning around. Not enough to pay the whole debt, about a third of it. Do not offer him money, Simon said. If you make a partial payment, you are acknowledging the debt as legitimate, which undermines the fraud challenge. She turned back from the window. So I just wait. You wait and trust the process and let Webb do his work. That is very easy advice to give, she said, not unkindly but with a bluntness that was entirely fair. I know it is, he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes that missed very little, and what she said next was quiet but very direct. Simon, are you afraid this is not going to work? He held her gaze. I am concerned about the timeline. I am not afraid it will not work. The evidence is strong. But there is a gap, she said, between Price's 60-day deadline and whatever the court does. Yes. What happens in that gap if the court does not move quickly enough? He had been turning this over since the moment Aurélie told him about the filing. There were several possible answers, none of them simple. He stood up because sitting still had become difficult. If it comes to that, he said, I will cover the debt myself. The silence that followed was very complete. Emma stared at him. You will not, she said. I have some resources, not a great deal, but enough to make a short-term arrangement with the land clerk that buys time for the court to act. Simon, her voice had gone very quiet. You cannot do that. Why not? Because it is too much, she said. And there was something in her voice now that was not the careful, measured tone he usually heard. Something that was slightly undone, slightly raw. You have already done too much. The social and the papers and the Sundays and staying in Ridgecreek when your work was finished, and now this. It is too much. He crossed the room and he stopped in front of her, and he was close enough now to see the precise quality of the expression on her face, which was the expression of someone standing at the edge of something and not quite sure whether to step forward or back. Emma, he said quietly, what would be the right amount? She looked at him. Her hands were very still at her sides. I do not know yet, she said. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to him, and they both knew it. That is a fair answer, he said. I will wait for you to figure it out. She was close enough that the choice was obvious and the moment was exactly what it was. He did not kiss her. He stood very close to her in her kitchen in the December dark, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and it was its own kind of intimacy. The kind that is sometimes more significant than anything more physical, because it was entirely chosen and entirely clear. Write to your Mr. Webb, she said finally, in a voice that was not quite steady. Tonight. I will, he said. He wrote the letter that night. the most detailed and urgent communication he had yet sent, explaining the collection filing and the 60-day window and the absolute necessity of getting an injunction in place before the deadline. He sent it with the morning stage. Then he waited. The days of December turned slowly. Ridgecreek was quiet in the way that frontier towns were quiet in winter, with the social life compressed into the warmth of the general store and the saloon and the occasional church social, where firewood was prioritized over elaborate programming. Emma came to town on Thursdays for supplies, and Simon was usually at the Delacroix Ranch, but made a point of being at the general store when she arrived, not conspicuously, but consistently. The town had not entirely forgiven her, but the specific cruelty of the supper social had faded, as cruelties do when they are not refreshed, and some of the women who had been cold to her in September were now merely neutral, which was progress. Aurélie Delacroix was openly warm to Emma whenever they encountered each other, which carried weight because Aurélie was well regarded, and Mrs. Calloway at the boarding house had begun defending Emma in conversations at the general store, not loudly but steadily, which was the way that reputations were repaired in small communities. Harlan Price was visible in Ridgecreek through December, but did not approach Emma directly and did not, as far as Simon could determine, make any moves against Simon himself, which meant either that Price had decided Simon was not worth the trouble or that he was being very patient. Simon thought it was the second option. Webb's response to the urgent letter arrived in the last week of December. The district court had agreed to hear an emergency injunction request. The hearing was scheduled for the 15th of January. If the injunction was granted, collection on the Brooks Farm debt would be halted pending the resolution of the fraud case. If it was not granted, they would have approximately 3 weeks before the 60-day deadline. Simon rode to the Brooks farm on the 28th of December with this news and found Emma in the barn doing some repair work on a saddle, with a competence that reminded him, again, of the gap between the woman he had expected to find 4 months ago and the one he actually knew. She read the letter he brought and looked up with an expression that was cautious but unmistakably hopeful. "January 15th, she said. "Yes, that is 2.5 weeks. Yes." She folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. "Good," she said. "That is good news." She held herself together through it with the same contained dignity she brought to everything, but he could see underneath it the relief she was not entirely suppressing. He wanted to say something that acknowledged it without embarrassing her, and in the end what he said was simply, "You have been very steady through all of this." She looked at him with a slight, private smile. "I have had good company," she said. New Year's Eve in Ridgecreek was marked by a modest gathering at the saloon that most of the town attended, a tradition of seeing the year out together that was more about community than celebration. Simon went because it would have been conspicuous not to, and because Emma had mentioned she would be there, and he wanted to see the year out with her if that was a possibility. She arrived with Aurélie Delacroix, which was a public statement in itself, because Aurélie's social endorsement was unambiguous. Simon found them near the stove, which was the most sensible place in the room, and they stood together through the turning of the year, talking about ordinary things, and when midnight arrived and the room erupted into noise and well-wishing and a few people who kissed their wives or sweethearts, Simon looked at Emma beside him and Emma looked back. And in that moment the particular quality of everything between them was impossible to mistake. He did not kiss her. She had not yet given him that answer she was working on, but she reached out and put her hand in his briefly, with the same decisive quality she brought to everything, and squeezed once and let go. It was enough. It was more than enough for now. January moved through its early days with a cold that was serious and not decorative. The 15th came. Simon had arranged with Aldous Webb to receive a telegraph at the Ridgecreek General Store as soon as the court's decision was known, since the telegraph line had reached Ridgecreek 2 years prior and was the fastest available communication. He spent the day at the Delacroix Ranch doing winter chores with the particular kind of focused mechanical attention that was required when you were waiting for something important and could not hurry it. The telegraph arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He knew from the way Mrs. Garrison at the general store was watching for him that the news had come, and he took the yellow slip of paper and read it standing at the counter. Injunction granted, stop collection halted pending fraud trial, stop PRYCE formally indicted this date, stop trial scheduled March, stop web. He read it twice. He read it a third time. Good news? Mrs. Garrison asked. She was a small woman with sharp eyes who liked knowing things. Very good news, Simon said. He rode to Emma's farm. She came to the door, and he handed her the telegraph and watched her read it. The expression that moved through her face was one of the most complete things he had ever witnessed. A full release of something she had been holding against the possibility of catastrophe for months. Her father's debt, the farm, her place in the community, all of it suddenly on a path toward resolution, held in the proper hands of the law, no longer dependent entirely on her own endurance. She pressed the telegraph slip against her chest for a moment with both hands, and she closed her eyes. And Simon stood on her porch and felt the cold air and watched her, and he was absolutely clear in that moment about everything. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, she said, in a voice that was the most unguarded he had ever heard from her, "It is going to be all right." "Yes," he said, "it is." She stepped forward and she put her arms around him, and he held her in the cold January afternoon, and she rested her head against his shoulder for a moment with the particular quality of exhaustion that follows long, sustained effort. He put his arms around her and felt the realness of her, solid and warm in the cold, and they stood like that for a moment that he thought he would remember for the rest of his life. She pulled back and looked at him. There was color in her face and her eyes were very bright. "Simon," she said, in a tone that was finally, after all these months of careful measuring, beginning to move toward something. "Emma," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that started somewhere deep and came out unguarded, and he realized he had never heard her laugh quite like that before, and it was one of the finest sounds he had encountered in his 31 years of living. "Ask me," she said. He was fairly certain he understood what she meant, but he wanted to be accurate. "Ask you what?" She tilted her head slightly, with an expression that was amused and direct and full of a warmth she was no longer working to conceal. "Ask me properly." He looked at her in the January afternoon light, with the cold ridge behind her and the farm spread out behind that, her mother's burial ground somewhere in the corner of the far field, the house her father had built that was going to stay hers. He had come here 4 months ago on assignment, as an investigator with a practical purpose. He was still an investigator, technically, until the trial was concluded. But that was not the most important thing about him in this moment. "Emma Brooks," he said, "I would like to court you properly and openly, and if you will allow me to, I would like eventually to ask you a question considerably more significant than anything I have asked before." She held his gaze, and something absolutely settled and warm came into her expression, the look of a person who has finally found solid ground after a very long time on uncertain footing. "Yes," she said, "to both." What followed in the weeks and months after the injunction was a kind of opening out of things that had been held tightly closed. The courtship of Emma Brooks and Simon Ellsworth, which was what the town of Ridgecreek began to call it with something between bemusement and approval, was not a dramatic or publicly performed affair. They were both too private for that. But it was visible, in the way that genuine things are always eventually visible, in the way he looked for her on Thursday mornings in town, and the way she looked for him, in the way Aurélie Delacroix smiled whenever she saw them at the same table. The social rehabilitation of Emma's reputation, which had been gradually proceeding since Aurélie's endorsement, accelerated considerably once it became generally understood that Harlan Price was facing a fraud trial. People who had been cold to Emma became warm again, some with genuine regret, and some with the slightly uncomfortable over-friendliness of those who were performing an apology they were too proud to make directly. Emma received these reversals with a gracious self-possession that Simon found admirable, because he thought he would have been considerably less generous about it. "Does it not anger you?" he asked her one Sunday in February, after Mrs. Holt, who had been one of the most prominent social cold shoulders in September, had stopped them in the street to invite Emma to the Women's Auxiliary Sewing Circle, which was the community's most significant female social institution. Emma considered this as they walked down the main street through the February cold. "It did," she said. "In November it made me very angry. Now I mostly feel tired by it and a little sad for what it reveals about people. But I do not want to carry it as permanent anger. That would give them too much of my interior space." He looked at her, this woman he was in love with her sensible coat and her brisk stride and her complicated, carefully managed heart, and he thought that she was one of the most fundamentally decent people he had ever known, and that the word decent was deeply insufficient to capture what he meant. "I have something to show you," he said. She looked at him. "What?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper which he handed her. She stopped walking and unfolded it and read it, and her expression changed. "This is a purchase agreement," she said. "For a piece of land just north of your eastern fence line," Simon said. "It belonged to a speculator who has been trying to sell it for 2 years. I have put a deposit on it, pending the outcome of some conversations, and it would be adjacent to your property." He was watching her face carefully. "I thought that if I was going to stay in Ridgecreek, it would be sensible to have a piece of ground to stay on." She looked at the paper and then at him with that clear, intelligent look that held a considerable amount of warmth now and not much of the early wariness. "You are staying," she said. "I told you that in September. I thought that was temporary." "So did I," he said. "And then it wasn't." She folded the paper and handed it back to him, and she put her arm through his in the way she had begun to do on their walks, a small practical gesture that was also something else. "It adjoins my north meadow," she said. "Yes. If the land is properly developed and the water rights are secured, it could support a small herd of cattle. That is what I thought. You would need help with that," she said, with a slight smile she was no longer hiding. "It is difficult work for one person." "I was hoping," Simon said, "to enter into a partnership." She laughed, the good unguarded laugh again, and he felt it all through him. "A partnership," she said. "A formal and permanent one," he said. "Once we have given this a proper period of being a courtship, which I understand to be the correct sequence of events." "An admirable attention to convention," she said, "from a man who bid $1 on a stranger's supper basket." 50 cents was not enough, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly as they walked, just for a moment, just long enough to say something true without words. The Harlan Price fraud trial took place in Pueblo in late March of 1883. Simon testified. He was in Pueblo for 8 days, and in his absence Emma managed the farm alone, which she was entirely capable of doing, and wrote him a letter that arrived on the 4th day that was mostly practical information about the farm and the weather and the state of the early spring ground, and at the end of it said, in her careful handwriting, that she found the house very quiet in the evenings and was looking forward to fewer quiet evenings. He read this letter 3 times and carried it in his coat pocket through the remaining days of the trial. Harlan Price was found guilty on 3 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of coercive debt manipulation. He was sentenced to 6 years in the Territorial Penitentiary and fined an amount that would be distributed among his victims through a court-supervised process. The Brooks farm debt was formally declared invalid and vacated under the fraud ruling. Emma's land was hers, fully and without encumbrance. Simon was on the stage back to Ridgecreek the morning after the verdict was read. He sat in the stage and watched the Colorado landscape roll past the window and felt something settle in him that had been in motion for 2 years, something that had started as professional determination and somewhere along the way become entirely, irrevocably personal. He arrived in Ridgecreek on a Wednesday morning in early April, when the ground was beginning to soften and the first suggestions of green were appearing at the edges of things. He went to the boarding house and left his bag, and then, without stopping to eat or rest, he borrowed Galveston and rode the 3 miles east. Emma was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, turning the first beds for spring planting. She heard Galveston's hooves and straightened up and shaded her eyes, and when she saw it was him, she put the garden fork down against the fence post and came toward him. He dismounted and tied the horse, and she stopped in front of him with the particular direct quality she always had, her hands still dark with garden soil. "Well," she said. "Guilty on all counts," he said. "6 years. The debt is vacated." She closed her eyes for just a moment. He watched the same release move through her that had come with the injunction telegram, but deeper now, because this was the final word, the real ending. When she opened her eyes, they were very bright. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She looked at him for a moment in the April morning, with the smell of new earth around them and the sharp, clean Colorado sky above them, and the particular quality of this place, her mother's burial ground in the corner of the far field, the house that was going to stay, the land that was going to stay. "Simon," she said, "ask me the other question now." He had thought about how to do this. He had thought about whether to have a ring, and had not had time to acquire one properly, and had made a different kind of plan. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, and her eyes went wide slightly because she recognized paper as the medium of significant things between them. She unfolded it. It was the purchase agreement for the land to the north of her east fence, completed and signed and dated, with his name on it. And at the bottom, in his handwriting, 4 words, because he was a man who used language economically and chose to put the weight of what he meant in the simplest possible arrangement of words. "Marry me, Emma Brooks." She stood with the paper in her soil-dark hands, and she looked at him. The April wind moved the hair at her temples. One of the chickens, somewhere behind them, made a comment on the proceedings. "Yes," she said. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, and she turned her face up toward his, and he kissed her for the first time, gently and then less gently, and she put her hands against his chest, her garden-dirty hands against his coat, and he felt the solid warmth of her, and she felt the same in him, and the Colorado morning went entirely gold around them. They were married in June of 1883 in the small Ridgecreek church, with Aurélie and François Delacroix as witnesses and most of Ridgecreek in attendance, because the town had by this point entirely rehabilitated its relationship with Emma and wished to express this in the most public and irreversible way available. Mrs. Holt brought a spectacular pie, which was her particular form of apology, and was warmly accepted. Gerald Stubbs, the auctioneer, wept, which surprised everyone including Gerald Stubbs. Emma wore a dress of cream-colored cotton that Aurélie had helped her make, and her dark hair was pinned up with the small pearl-topped pins that had been her mother's. Simon wore a new coat of dark blue wool that he had traveled to Denver to purchase specifically, which Emma told him he had no business doing, and which she then told him looked very well, which somewhat undermined the first statement. The ring was a slim gold band that he had made by the jeweler in Denver, who also supplied the general stores of the territory, and it fit her finger exactly because he had asked Aurélie to measure it while Emma was not paying attention, which was either resourceful or scheming, depending on one's perspective. They spoke their vows in the simple, direct language of the time, and Simon, who was not a man who showed a great deal in public, had a quality of expression during those vows that the people who were watching described afterward in various ways, but which all came down to the same thing, which was that this was a man making a promise he had thought about very carefully and was making with his entire self. After the ceremony, the town held a supper in the open air behind the church, which was the same location where the supper basket social had been held the previous September, which was not lost on anyone present and was, Emma thought, a rather elegant resolution to the story. She sat at the center of it all with Simon beside her, and she thought about the woman she had been 9 months ago, standing at that table with her hands knotted together, and the crowd's back turned toward her. And she thought about the man who had been standing at the back, quiet and certain and unperformed in his kindness. And she thought that the distance between that moment and this one was one of the stranger and more unexpected journeys she had ever taken. The land Simon had purchased was incorporated into the Brooks Farm operation that summer, with a new fence line and a well dug at the most useful point, and the beginning of a small cattle operation that was modest but promising. Simon had found, to his own mild surprise, that he was genuinely suited to farm and ranch work, that the practical, physical, daily rhythm of it agreed with him in a way that the more itinerant investigative work had not. He continued to do some land consulting work for the district court, reviewing documents in other cases that Webb referred to him. But this he did from home, at the kitchen table that was now unambiguously their kitchen table. Emma continued to run the farm accounts with the same competent authority she always had, and Simon discovered fairly quickly that the right arrangement was to do what she said regarding the finances, and to apply his own judgment regarding the structural and livestock matters, and to have very frank conversations when these areas overlapped. They were both people with strong opinions and the intellectual confidence to hold them, which meant that they disagreed occasionally with complete directness, and that their disagreements resolved faster and more cleanly than either of them had expected, because neither of them used silence as a weapon or grievances as currency. By the spring of 1884, Emma was carrying their first child. She told Simon on a quiet Tuesday evening when the early spring light was still in the sky, and they had just come in from the evening chores, and she said it with the particular quality of her best announcements, which was direct and warm in equal measure. His response was to go very still for a moment, and then to pull her into his arms with a completeness and tenderness that made her laugh, the good unguarded laugh, against his shoulder. The baby arrived in October of 1884, a boy they named William after Emma's father, which felt to both of them like the right act of reclamation, giving the name back its dignity. He was a healthy, serious-faced infant who seemed to be taking note of everything from his first hours, which Emma said was a family trait. They continued to build things. The north meadow was fenced and seeded the following year. A second bedroom was added to the house in 1885 when it became evident they would need it, which proved accurate when a daughter arrived in 1886, whom they named Clara after Simon's mother. William, by then 18 months old, regarded his sister with the severe critical attention of a very young person who has been suddenly demoted in household significance. But by the time Clara was 6 months old, he had appointed himself her protector in a way that was both touching and slightly excessive. Ridgecreek grew through those years as the territory continued to develop, and the Ellsworth farm, which was what people had begun to call it, combining the two properties into a single understood unit, grew with it. They added cattle in 1886 and increased the herd in 1887. Simon hired a farmhand, a young man of 20 named Eli Marsh who was from Kansas, and who was reliable and good with horses, and who ate his meals at the farm table with the family in the unceremonious way of working households. Harlan Price served his sentence in the Territorial Penitentiary and was released in 1889, by which point he had no remaining financial interests in Ridgecreek and relocated elsewhere, which was both predictable and satisfactory. The land he had taken from other families through his fraudulent schemes was largely restored through the court process that Webb had supervised, a slow and imperfect justice but a real one. And Simon took a quiet satisfaction in this that he rarely spoke about, but that Emma understood without needing it explained. In 1890, Emma discovered she was expecting again. She was 34 years old, and this was their third child, and she told Simon about it on a winter morning in the kitchen with William at the table doing his lessons and Clara asleep upstairs, And Simon's reaction this time was to sit down and look at her with an expression of such complete, uncomplicated joy that she felt it like light. "3 children," he said. "3 children," she confirmed. "This farm is going to need to be larger," he said, with absolute practicality and absolute warmth in the same sentence, which was so exactly him that she laughed. This third child arrived in July of 1890, a boy they named James, who came into the world with enormous energy and a voice that could be heard at considerable distances, which Clara found fascinating and William found inconvenient. Simon held James in his arms the evening after he was born, standing at the bedroom window in the July dusk, and Emma watched him from the bed with the easy, encompassing love that had been building since that first Sunday at this kitchen table, and she thought about everything that had led to this, the difficult path, the dark past that could have broken things before they began, the forced choice she had refused, the quiet man at the back of the crowd who had stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. She was grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because the hard parts were what had brought her here. "Simon," she said. He turned from the window with the baby in his arms. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put her hand on his arm, and they were both quiet for a moment with James sleeping between them, and the summer evening light was warm and gold through the window. And outside, somewhere in the yard, William was explaining something to Clara in the earnest voice he used when he had decided she needed educating, and one of the chickens, which they had always managed to maintain in a state of indignant plenty, was contributing an opinion. "I want to tell you something," Emma said. He looked at her. His gray eyes were steady and warm, the color of a sky when the weather is certain. "That basket," she said. "The one you bid $1 on." "I remember it," he said. "I packed it thinking no one would want it," she said. "Not that year. After everything with my father and what I knew Price was going to do, I nearly did not bring it at all." She paused. "I am very glad I brought it." Simon was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had gone through him completely. "I am very glad I was standing at the back of that crowd," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, very carefully, so as not to disturb the sleeping James, and she closed her eyes, and she felt the solid warmth of him and the weight of the sleeping baby and the sound of her older children in the yard outside, and the farm around them, her mother's ground and her father's rebuilt name and their shared future, all of it present and real and hers and his. And she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like when things finally came right. Not a sudden, dramatic arrival, but an accumulation. Not a grand gesture, but 1,000 small ones. $1 bid at a supper social, a cup of coffee on a cold afternoon, a hand over another hand at a kitchen table, a telegraph that changed everything, a folded piece of paper with 4 words at the bottom, and all the ordinary Sundays and ordinary mornings and ordinary and extraordinary days that followed, building this life, their life, which was not perfect but was real and warm and theirs. Outside, the Colorado summer evening settled into the deep blue of early night, and somewhere to the east a coyote called once and was answered, and the stars came out over the ridge one by one, and the Ellsworth farm was lit from inside with lamplight that made the windows gold against the dark, and inside that light were the 4 of them, soon to be 5 when one counted Eli, who would arrive for breakfast at 6 in the morning and eat at their table like the family he had become. And the chickens and the cattle and the horses, and all the practical and impractical elements of a life being lived with full intention and with love that had been built slowly and carefully, and for that reason was entirely sound. It held everything, that light, and it would go on holding everything for a very long time.